June 23, 1942 dawned quietly over Pembry Airfield in South Wales, yet the calm was deceiving. A single German fighter, the Focke-Wulf 190, descended through the clouds, its pilot disoriented and unaware of the consequences his actions would soon unleash. Oberleutnant Armen Faber, a skilled pilot of Jagdgeschwader 2, had been flying escort for German bombers over the English Channel. In the chaos of combat, with cloud cover obscuring the coastline and the sun misleading his sense of direction, he made a fatal misjudgment. Believing he was returning to a Luftwaffe base in occupied France, he brought the WW190 down to a gentle landing on a British runway. The world would change in the moments that followed, not through a deliberate strike, but through an error that would offer the Allies the rarest gift in wartime: knowledge. When Faber exited his cockpit and faced the airfield, the truth was undeniable. The aircraft lining the flight line were Spitfires, and the personnel rushing toward him wore RAF blue. British intelligence officers realized immediately that they had captured one of the most feared fighters of the war intact. For months, the FW-190 had dominated the skies over Europe, seemingly invincible against Allied fighters. Reports from the front described an aircraft faster in level flight, deadlier in armament, and unmatched in roll rate. The Spitfire Mark V's that had once ruled the skies could not match it in maneuverability or firepower. Every dogfight against the FW-190 ended with losses, and experienced pilots who had survived the Battle of Britain found themselves helpless against this new threat. Faber's navigational error now placed the key to countering this superior technology directly into Allied hands. Within hours, the captured FW-190 was transported to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, where the finest British engineers and test pilots examined it in meticulous detail. What they discovered was both extraordinary and instructive. The aircraft was a product of relentless engineering focused on practical combat effectiveness. Its BMW 801 radial engine produced 1,700 horsepower, far surpassing the Merlin engines of contemporary Spitfires. Yet power alone did not account for the FW-190's lethal reputation. Its roll rate allowed pilots to snap from bank to bank with astonishing speed, giving them the tactical advantage in engagements where Allied pilots had previously been forced to react defensively. Its armament, 420mm cannons coupled with machine guns, could unleash destructive fire in bursts that dwarfed the Spitfire's capabilities. Every detail, from gun placement to cockpit layout, had been optimized for rapid target acquisition and lethal precision. The FW-190's advantages, however, came with limitations. Tests revealed that the radial engine struggled at high altitudes, losing efficiency above 20,000 feet. Its heavier airframe reduced its ability to sustain prolonged turning engagements, and its controls became physically taxing at high speeds, particularly in steep dives. These vulnerabilities were invisible to pilots in combat who had not seen the aircraft in controlled conditions, and it was precisely this knowledge that transformed Allied strategy. British intelligence immediately circulated tactical guidance, teaching pilots to exploit altitude advantages, force German fighters into sustained turning battles, and press attacks when the FW-190 struggled with high-speed controls. These lessons extended beyond theory. American pilots arriving in Britain were invited to Farnborough to fly the captured aircraft themselves, experiencing firsthand the machine that had dominated European skies. The intelligence gained from Faber's blunder did more than inform tactics. It reshaped Allied doctrine and aircraft design. The P-47 Thunderbolt, then entering combat, benefited from lessons in roll responsiveness, aileron control, and concentrated firepower. Spitfire upgrades, particularly the Merlin engine Mark 9, addressed weaknesses previously exploited by the FW-190, allowing Allied forces to compete at all altitudes. Pilots now had confidence in engagements where they had previously flown with fear, transforming psychological intimidation into strategic opportunity. Combat reports in late 1942 and early 1943 reflected a shift. Allied forces engaged FW-190s from positions of calculated advantage, exploiting weaknesses in engine performance, maneuverability, and pilot workload. The kill ratios began to improve, the balance of air power tilting incrementally back in favor of Britain and the United States. Faber himself, meanwhile, remained in custody, transported first to British intelligence facilities and eventually to a prisoner of war camp in Canada. His error, initially viewed with anger and disbelief by German command, was later understood as a rare instance of combat disorientation. High-speed maneuvers, cloud cover, and sun glare had combined to create a perfect storm of navigational failure. He survived the war, returning to Germany in 1945, carrying with him the knowledge that a single mistake had altered the course of aerial warfare in Europe. Historians today recognize that the intelligence gleaned from the intact FW-190 likely saved hundreds, if not thousands, of Allied lives. Training manuals, fighter tactics, and aircraft design were forever changed by the unplanned delivery of Germany's premier fighter to the Allies. By the summer of 1943, the tactical advantage gained from the captured FW-190 was fully integrated into Allied operations. American P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, equipped with new insights into the German fighters' strengths and vulnerabilities, approached the skies over Europe with renewed confidence. Pilots were trained to engage FW-190s only under conditions that exploited their weaknesses. High-altitude patrols became standard, forcing German pilots into thin air where their radial engines lost power. Dogfights were no longer about matching the FW-190's superior roll rate. Instead, Allied pilots focused on sustained turning engagements at altitudes where the FW-190 struggled to maneuver effectively. Tactical bulletins emphasized patience, discipline, and the importance of maintaining altitude advantage. The once feared invincible fighter was no longer an unknown entity. It had become a machine whose behavior could be anticipated, countered, and defeated. American fighter groups also benefited from practical experimentation. Pilots who flew the captured FW-190 returned with first-hand experience of the aircraft's handling characteristics. They learned that while the FW-190 could outroll and outdive many Allied fighters, it required significant physical effort to control in high-speed maneuvers. They discovered that the radial engine, though powerful, could overheat under prolonged strain at low altitudes or in sustained climbs. Understanding these limitations allowed Allied pilots to set traps in combat, force the FW-190 into extended maneuvers or climbing engagements, exploit moments of pilot fatigue, and strike when control became more difficult. Even the placement of weapons was studied, teaching Allied pilots the optimal angles for attack and defense, maximizing their firepower while minimizing exposure to return fire. The influence of the captured FW-190 extended beyond pilot training into broader strategic planning. Bomber escort missions were redesigned with knowledge of the aircraft's operational envelope. Previously, bomber formations suffered devastating losses when FW-190s attacked at low altitude, exploiting their speed and firepower. With the intelligence gained from Faber's mistake, escort fighters could position themselves above or behind the German fighters, dictating the terms of engagement and protecting the vulnerable bombers. RAF and USAF planners realized that air superiority was not solely about aircraft numbers, but about understanding and exploiting technological advantages. The captured FW-190 became a blueprint for countering one of the most effective tools in the Luftwaffe's arsenal. In parallel, engineers at Wright Field and British aircraft design bureaus used the FW-190 as a case study to improve Allied aircraft. The concentration of weaponry in the FW-190 wings, its streamlined fuselage and responsive ailerons inspired modifications to the P-47 and P-51, enhancing their roll rates, control responsiveness, and gunnery efficiency. Lessons learned about weight distribution, high-speed control, and pilot ergonomics informed future fighter designs. The FW-190's influence persisted even as new German variants appeared.
When the FW-190D9 Dora was introduced, analysts immediately compared it to the captured aircraft, assessing improvements and predicting potential weaknesses. The continuous study of the original intact FW-190 allowed Allied forces to stay one step ahead in the ongoing technological arms race of the air war. The human dimension of Faber's error was equally profound. Pilots who once approached the skies over Europe with fear now possessed actionable knowledge. Confidence replaced trepidation. Strategy replaced improvisation. In combat, P-47 and P-51 squadrons exploited these lessons, engaging FW-190s on terms dictated by Allied pilots rather than the enemy. Kill ratios shifted, attrition of Luftwaffe units increased, and German pilots were forced to adapt to a foe whose capabilities they could no longer intimidate through mystery alone. Faber, isolated in a Canadian prisoner of war camp, could not have known the full consequences of his mistake. What seemed at the time a navigational error with minor tactical implications became, in retrospect, one of the most significant intelligence coups of World War II. Allied commanders, pilots, and engineers leveraged this fortuitous gift to counter the German fighter threat systematically. The captured FW-190 shifted the balance in air combat, proving that superior technology alone does not determine victory. Knowledge and understanding of that technology, combined with disciplined application in combat, can change the course of battles and, ultimately, wars.
By late 1943, the operational impact of the captured FW-190 became strikingly evident in the skies over Europe. Allied pilots, armed with intimate knowledge of the aircraft's strengths and weaknesses, began engaging the Luftwaffe in ways that neutralized the FW-190's early dominance. In missions over northern France and the Low Countries, American P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs would climb to altitudes above 25,000 feet, knowing the FW-190's radial engine would lose power in the thinner air. German pilots, expecting low-altitude engagements where their aircraft excelled, were forced to pursue Allied fighters into a domain where their performance suffered. Once at high altitude, the Americans could dictate the pace of combat, exploiting the FW-190's declining maneuverability and setting up attacks with minimal risk. The captured FW-190 also transformed escort tactics for bomber formations. Previously, unescorted bombers had suffered devastating losses to FW-190s attacking at low altitude, where their speed and concentrated armament overwhelmed defensive fire. With intelligence gleaned from the captured aircraft, fighter escorts could patrol above and around bomber formations, anticipating the angles and approaches the FW-190 would favor. Pilots learned to exploit the German fighter's slower roll rate and sustained turns, and its heavy controls at high speeds. These adaptations dramatically reduced bomber casualties, increased mission success rates, and allowed the Allies to maintain pressure on German industrial and military targets. In many ways, a single navigational error by one Luftwaffe pilot directly saved hundreds of Allied airmen and preserved the strategic momentum of the Allied bombing campaign. The lessons from the FW-190 were integrated into training programs across both the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces. Simulated combat against aircraft mimicking the FW-190's flight characteristics became standard practice. Tactical bulletins emphasized altitude discipline, attack positioning, and the exploitation of high-speed control limitations. Pilots were instructed to avoid prolonged low-altitude dogfights and instead maneuver for engagements where the FW-190's weaknesses could be exploited. Even the psychological impact of familiarity cannot be understated. The once feared fighter, previously thought invincible, became a known adversary. Allied pilots now faced the aircraft with confidence rather than fear, and this shift in morale had tangible consequences in combat effectiveness. The intelligence coup also influenced the broader course of air strategy. Understanding the FW-190's limitations at high altitude informed the planning of bomber raids deep into German territory. Commanders could now structure escort schedules, approach routes, and engagement envelopes to exploit the German fighters' vulnerabilities. When new variants appeared, the captured aircraft served as a baseline for comparison, allowing Allied engineers and tacticians to anticipate improvements and adjust strategies accordingly. The FW-190D9 Dora, introduced in 1944 with an inline engine designed to mitigate the original's altitude weaknesses, was immediately analyzed against the captured aircraft.
This foresight prevented German designers from regaining the element of surprise and ensured that Allied forces maintained a tactical edge throughout the remainder of the air war over Europe. Even beyond immediate tactical applications, the captured FW-190 shaped Allied aircraft development. Engineers at Wright Field and in British aircraft factories studied its aerodynamics, weapon placement, and cockpit layout. They adapted lessons in roll responsiveness, weapon concentration, and high-speed control to improve P-47 and P-51 designs. Innovations inspired by the FW-190 contributed to the development of more versatile and survivable aircraft, capable of matching or surpassing German fighters in both speed and firepower. The aircraft's design influenced not only operational tactics, but the evolution of Allied air power, proving that a single intelligence windfall could ripple across strategy, technology, and training with profound effects. The story of Armen Faber's navigation error became a case study in the critical importance of intelligence, observation, and technological understanding in warfare. One disoriented pilot, unaware of the magnitude of his mistake, delivered to the Allies a weapon that had haunted the skies of Europe. The lessons derived from that aircraft altered engagement protocols, reshaped training programs, and enabled Allied forces to exploit weaknesses that had previously been unknown. By the time the FW-190 was fully understood, it had ceased to be a symbol of invincibility, and instead became a tool through which the Allies could anticipate, counter, and dominate the Luftwaffe in aerial combat.
The real impact of the captured FW-190 became visible in aerial engagements over northern Europe in 1943 and 1944. Pilots reported immediate changes in combat behavior, with Allied fighters taking the initiative in encounters that previously would have favored the Luftwaffe. One notable example occurred during bomber escort missions over France in the summer of 1943. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, now trained with specific knowledge of the FW-190's performance, maintained high-altitude patrols, patiently forcing German pilots to follow them upward. As the FW-190s struggled to maintain power in the thin air, Allied pilots could choose when and how to engage, turning what had once been a lethal opponent into a manageable threat. Engagements that might have resulted in heavy losses were now fought on Allied terms, and the Luftwaffe began noticing the shift in combat outcomes. The captured FW-190 also influenced squadron-level tactics in fighter sweeps over occupied Europe. Pilots were instructed to avoid traditional dogfighting against the FW-190 at low altitudes where the aircraft excelled in roll rate and armament. Instead, the strategy emphasized altitude advantage, energy management, and positioning. Pilots would feint low, baiting the FW-190 into pursuit, then climb aggressively to a higher position where their own aircraft had the upper hand. This deliberate use of tactical knowledge, learned from first-hand analysis of the German fighter, turned previously desperate engagements into calculated battles. The approach reduced Allied losses and allowed pilots to exploit weaknesses in the FW-190's design that had previously gone unnoticed or unexploited. Individual pilot experiences further underscored the importance of this intelligence. Captain Kaz Hoove, an American test pilot who had flown the captured aircraft, returned to operational units and shared first-hand insights about handling and limitations. His guidance enabled fighter pilots to recognize subtle cues in the FW-190's behavior during combat. The heavy controls at high speed, engine cooling vulnerabilities at altitude, and the aircraft's relative inability to sustain prolonged turns became actionable knowledge. Pilots could exploit these factors during dogfights, choosing the timing and angle of engagement to maximize their advantage. Within months, after-action reports showed a clear trend. Allied aircrews were achieving higher kill ratios against FW-190s, while losses to the aircraft dropped significantly compared to previous months. The FW-190's captured example also proved invaluable in training future generations of Allied pilots. Simulators and mock aerial exercises incorporated the characteristics of the German fighter, allowing pilots to practice against an accurate representation of their former adversary. New tactics, including high-altitude intercepts, energy retention maneuvers, and controlled engagement sequences, became standard instruction.
By integrating real data and first-hand experience, the Allies ensured that even inexperienced pilots could confront FW-190s with confidence and competence. The psychological effect of this preparation was immense, reducing the fear and uncertainty that had once accompanied any sighting of the German fighter. A machine that had once symbolized danger and invincibility became, in the hands of the Allies, a blueprint for success. Beyond immediate combat, the captured FW-190 influenced operational planning and broader air strategy. Allied commanders could now calculate engagement probabilities more accurately, design escort routes with reduced risk, and deploy fighter sweeps that took full advantage of the German aircraft's weaknesses. Bombing missions over industrial targets and transportation networks benefited from this intelligence, as the reduced threat from FW-190s allowed bombers to maintain formation and reach their objectives with fewer losses. In effect, the delivery of a single aircraft had a cascading strategic effect, shaping operational outcomes, tactical choices, and even long-term air doctrine. The Allies had turned what was initially a chance event into a decisive tool for planning and victory.
The capture of the FW-190 had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical advantages it provided. Allied planners now had not only a blueprint of the aircraft's capabilities, but also a deeper understanding of German design philosophy. This knowledge allowed them to anticipate the development of subsequent Luftwaffe fighters and adjust their own aircraft programs accordingly. Engineers at Wright Field and Farnborough studied the FW-190's radial engine layout, its aileron responsiveness, and the placement of armament, incorporating lessons into both upgrades of existing aircraft and entirely new designs. American and British pilots trained rigorously using this intelligence, learning how to exploit the FW-190's vulnerabilities at high altitudes and during prolonged engagements, shifting the balance of power in the air war over Europe. Beyond technical insights, the psychological impact on German pilots was profound. Luftwaffe aces, once confident in the superiority of their aircraft, now faced adversaries who had inside knowledge of the FW-190's strengths and weaknesses. This eroded the aura of invincibility that had allowed German pilots to dominate early engagements and force them into riskier combat maneuvers that increasingly favored the Allies. The dissemination of the intelligence went further than tactics and training manuals. It shaped operational planning for bomber escorts, fighter sweeps, and air support for ground operations. P-47 Thunderbolts and Spitfire squadrons began emphasizing altitude advantage and coordinated attacks that capitalized on the FW-190's known limitations. Allied pilots were no longer reacting blindly to an unfamiliar foe. They were making informed decisions with confidence, which reduced casualties and increased mission success rates. The strategic ramifications of Faber's mistake became even clearer as the war progressed. Each new variant of the FW-190 was evaluated against the original captured aircraft, giving the Allies a baseline for comparison and allowing rapid adjustments to combat techniques. This continuous analysis created a feedback loop that maintained Allied superiority in fighter engagements. While Germany continued to produce formidable aircraft, the intelligence gleaned from a single disoriented pilot had neutralized the element of surprise that had made the FW-190 so deadly. This incident also underscored the importance of human factors in warfare. Despite Germany's advanced engineering, the war's outcome could hinge on human error, decision-making under stress, and the interpretation of circumstances in real time. The Allies had turned one mistake into a decisive advantage, demonstrating the value of adaptability and the ability to learn from opportunities as they arose. By the end of 1943, the cumulative effect of this intelligence coup was evident in shifting kill ratios and the declining effectiveness of German fighter tactics at all levels. The captured FW-190 had become more than a single aircraft. It was a symbol of how information, training, and tactical insight could outweigh raw technological superiority on the battlefield. The post-war analysis of the FW-190 incident highlighted its enduring significance in both aviation history and military strategy. Armen Faber's accidental delivery of the aircraft provided a case study in how a single event could ripple across technology, tactics, and human lives. Allied pilots, armed with the knowledge gained from the captured FW-190, had fought more effectively, saved countless lives, and forced the Luftwaffe to alter their operational methods. Engineers and designers applied lessons from the FW-190 to subsequent aircraft, influencing not only World War II designs, but also the post-war evolution of fighter planes. The principle that emerged was clear. Understanding your enemy's strengths and weaknesses, even through chance, can be as decisive as firepower. In the broader scope of the air war over Europe, this intelligence windfall shifted the balance in favor of the Allies. Air campaigns became more calculated, fighter engagements more strategic, and the psychological edge held by German pilots was eroded. The FW-190, once a symbol of invincibility, had become an open book, studied, countered, and ultimately neutralized. For historians, the story of the captured FW-190 illustrates the intersection of human error, technological innovation, and strategic advantage. One pilot's navigational mistake inadvertently provided the Allies with a key to survival and victory in the skies. Armen Faber spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner, but the legacy of his error endured long after the conflict ended. It became a teaching example in intelligence, aviation, and tactical decision-making. The lesson remains timeless. In warfare, the most sophisticated weapons can be undone by circumstances, and the smallest opportunities, when seized or discovered, can have monumental consequences. The FW-190's journey from feared German fighter to Allied intelligence asset demonstrates how preparation, adaptability, and knowledge can transform even chance events into turning points. The story concludes with the recognition that technological superiority alone does not guarantee victory. Insight, analysis, and the human ability to act on information remain decisive. In the end, the FW-190 was more than an aircraft. It was a turning point in the air war over Europe, a symbol of how understanding, ingenuity, and a single mistake could reshape the course of history.